don't need a pilot.
Let me just say, if I was on that plane, it wouldn't have went down like it did. Actually, the last time I was on a plane, the blubberknot sitting next to me absolutely should have bought 2 seats. And before we took off, his wife was telling me about when she worked at the Playboy Resort in Wisconsin, which I didn't know existed. It was hard to decide which was the scarier prospect. This jabroni wolfing down his in-flight meal with half his stomach spilling over into my lap, or a Playboy mansion filled with Green Bay Packers fans in the state with perhaps the highest per capita supply of beer bellies in the world. Well, I didn't have to wait long. Old Snacky Chan spilled 3 times on me, and I spent the last 8 hours with my crotch soaking wet from whatever he was drinking, and pasta sauce all over my shorts until I arrived in Spain, so if you think the flight they took in this movie was bad.
That flight was a f***ing nightmare, man. My stupid tray table broke and I ended up with a gallon of coffee in my crotch. It's like dunking my wang in hot lava.
This is going to be one of the shorter plot summaries I've ever had to do, so we'll be able to get right into what's good and what's bad about the film. Winston, his last name obviously isn't important, is hiding out in Alaska making some cup noodles when the U.S. Marshals come a-knocking. You see, Winston is the accountant for one crime lord Moretti, and because accountants aren't exactly known for being tough guys willing to do hard time, he immediately offers to flip on Moretti upon his capture.
What a baby.
So they need to safely transfer Winston back to New York and put him in protective custody.
You should have put him in custody.
However, safely is the operative word here, since they're in the middle of Alaska and are going to have to take a rickety single-prop plane back to Anchorage before getting on a real plane back to the continental United States. And uh-oh, the man flying the plane is not the man who's supposed to be flying it. Instead, it's Mark Wahlberg, and he's a sadistic, psychopathic hitman who works for Mr. Moretti and is there to make sure Winston doesn't make it back to testify against him. So it's up to Madeline to overpower Mark Wahlberg, whose character never even gets a name, and manage the murderer in her plane, the witness she needs to protect, get this plane to Anchorage, parse through the breadcrumbs of information the story drops throughout to piece together how it is Moretti even knew they had Winston, and figure out how to land a rickety old prop plane despite being a woman. I mean, despite never having flown a plane before. You know, back when I reviewed M. Night Shyamalan's Trap last summer, I lamented how the movie started as a tight story constrained both by time and a small, controlled environment, but eventually branched out and shook the shackles loose that was keeping the storytelling disciplined, sending it into convoluted chaos. I love movies that can tell an engaging story in a single setting and or in real time. It forces the writer and director to be disciplined and not get distracted with elaborate set pieces or be tempted to pad the runtime with useless transitions between settings. When you have a movie that's constrained like this, you typically have a movie that's clean, tight, and only as long as it absolutely needs to be. You also don't raise that many questions about the world building or why everything is happening the way it is. 12 Angry Men's premise is simple. A jury is deciding whether to convict or acquit a young man in a murder trial. Any questions? No, how could there be? The details of the trial, the very small scope of the movie, will be revealed as the story progresses. In 1917, 2 soldiers are tasked with delivering a letter to one of the other units in their army, requiring them to make a journey that will take them through hostile areas to order the commander to call off the attack that has been set as a trap. Very simple. And in flight risk, a U.S. Marshal has to escort a fugitive-turned-witness on a flight that gets hijacked by a hitman so he can testify against a crime boss in an upcoming trial. And that simple premise takes care of most of the questions you have. The others are explained as the movie gives you more and more tidbits of information. Why do the 2 agents that were with Madeline not go with her in the plane? Well, they're in a big rush to get Winston back to New York so he can testify, so they need to leave immediately. And the available plane they have can only carry 2 people plus the pilot. Why is Mark Wahlberg in Alaska? Well, Moretti clearly has an informant within the U.S. Marshals, so they knew about the upcoming operation. Speaking of Mark Wahlberg, he actually takes a back seat, both literally and figuratively, in this movie. He does a fine job with the character he's playing, a completely unhinged, masochistic lunatic, but it's not the center stage role you would expect from a big name like him, especially since he's the one on the poster. He's really there because he's friends with Mel Gibson, and the powerhouse combo of one of the girls from Downton Abbey and the OG Eddie Brock probably wouldn't have been a huge draw for an action thriller on their own.
See you, chump. What the hell?
Michelle Dockery's performance is okay. It's not a super special character she's playing, but she plays the scared and determined agent who doesn't know who she can trust really as well as you can expect. It's Topher Grace's character that's the weak link. He oscillates between being petrified to death to quippy much more than he should. If he's a wuss, which it's made clear from the opening scene that he is, he should be terrified throughout. But there are times when I feel like I'm watching Eric Foreman.
About 1 minute. Now, Donna, I'm not bragging, but if you're properly motivated, I can actually do it in that amount of time.
The film has some rough dialogue throughout it, like really rough, and most of it falls on Topher Grace to deliver. Now, this movie isn't without its plot holes, at all, but the plot holes are a lot more forgivable than we're used to. Madeline makes plenty of mistakes throughout the runtime of the film, and typically I get upset when a film's plot is forwarded by characters making stupid decisions. I think it reflects the writer's level of intelligence if they can't make an interesting story led by smart characters on both sides. But here, Madeline's mistakes kinda make sense. She's in an incredibly high-stress situation that she's really not prepared for. She's been sidelined to a desk for years after disgracing herself in her last mission. She's prone to making mistakes, and Mark Wahlberg's character takes advantage of them whenever she makes them. Although when she forgets about a knife that she knows is important, it's only slightly better than when The Last Jedi forgot about a pretty important knife. But I'm going to defend a couple of the most common complaints I've seen. First, why doesn't Madeline just shoot Mark Wahlberg? Well, the movie's explanation is because the bullet might ricochet off the metal of the plane and hit something important like a fuel line, or her or the witness. But how about you probably don't want to put a hole in your plane, which would probably happen. Sure, they're not at 37,000 feet, but they're flying the aviation equivalent of a rusty smart car. And from a physics standpoint, poking a hole that allows pressure difference on one side of the aircraft would make it a lot more difficult to keep the plane steady. The other complaint I've seen is that the pilot Madeline finally connects with, who walks her through how to fly the plane, is flirting with her. I actually like this. It's clear that the shock of this guy flirting with her kind of distracts her from the situation and helps to calm her down, even as the situation becomes more and more dire. This movie's not great, but it's good enough that I feel I can say you probably won't regret seeing it on a big screen. And with what nowadays is a minuscule $25 million budget, it'll be a miracle if it isn't profitable quickly. I compared it to chamber pieces like 12 Angry Men or Castaway. It doesn't hold a candle to those. But I'll say it's much better than many of the reviews online would have you believe. Most of those reviews come in from critics seemingly unable to separate the art from the artist. So I might be the only one on the internet brave, or perhaps stupid, enough to defend this film, but I will gladly bear that cross. And yes, that was a Passion of the Christ reference.
All right, the sauce.
What?
The sauce. I don't know. You're using too much sauce. Okay? Review's over.